So, welcome to today's Tech Hour. It's Thursday, the 24th of March, 2022. And due to a special disjunction, which is that the time difference between us and New York is now 4 hours rather than 5, we're no longer conflicting with the math working group of the W3CG. And this disjunction allows Bruce and Deyan to participate for the first time. So that's fantastic. I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm a former chair of UK TUG, a former board member. I'm more a thinker than a developer. I'm trained as a pure mathematician for most of this century. I worked as the LaTeX officer at the Open University, where my main job was supporting the production of course materials for mathematics and upper level physics. I'm now retired, and I would say that my primary activity include going out for a bike ride whenever I can, mathematical research, matters related to tech, and taking care of my good health. I'll pass over to somebody else, perhaps William or Nelson.
Okay, I'm an old retired programmer. I enjoy using and learning about tech and LaTeX.
And next.
Yeah, so I'm Nelson Beebe at the University of Utah Mathematics Department. I'm still working more than full time. We have a large department. We have almost 20,000 students a year go through our department. So, and I've been involved with tech since the late 1970s, including a lot of work in software related to tech and bibliographic work related to BibTech. So on to the next.
Patrick, Philip?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can, Philip.
Okay, yeah, Philip Helbig. I've used LaTeX since 1991, I guess, primarily to write scientific papers in cosmology. I've worked in cosmology. I worked at the stock exchange for 20 years. I'm retired early from that. And yeah, so do LaTeX when I can. There's some computer or network problem at my end. I can't turn on my video, at least it appears to be off, and I can't access the chat or anything, but I can see and hear everyone fine. So I think I'll just leave it. I can't even try to leave and come back. So, but as long as I can see and hear you, that's enough, because I'm sort of tired for some reason today. I don't know why. I probably won't say much anyway.
You're practicing being visually disabled. Patrick?
I'm Patrick Smith. I run a business called IOTA School. It's about accessible technical training. And I teach data science here in New York City. And I'm interested in accessibility in documents. And I'm a Python programmer.
Okay, I've got a message from Rod. I'm at the airport and not in a position to interact. First time at one of these tech hours. Rod is an attorney, self-taught computer programming, expertise in Internet of Things consulting with a legal and compliance focus. So I think that leaves Bruce and Deyan to introduce themselves, and they are, as I said, our special guests, and they have a particular shared interest in the W3C Math Working Group and LaTeX to ML, for which Bruce is the driving force, and questions of accessibility. So over to you, Bruce and Deyan.
Well, let's see. I guess I should start. How far back into the dark ages should this start? I guess I started as an experimental physicist, and Abramovitz and Stagen was one of the main books used anytime we had to do theory. So I was very fond of it. somewhere, I think, didn't manage to get to use tech in my dissertation, but had just begun to dabble with it at that time. So yeah, one thing comes to another. I end up at a postdoc at National Bureau of Standards. Do various kinds of work dynamics and this and that, and gradually moving towards more symbolic kinds of computation. I didn't go there because of the Abramovitz and Stegan heritage, but once in the late 90s, when there was some rumbling, there was perhaps the opportunity to update it and do a new version. I jumped on that as something I wanted to be part of. Well, as it started to take shape, as a project to do that started to take shape, and the resources and people started to become available to work on that, it was clear that I mean, LaTeX was the only choice to be working with this. You know, at that time, the sense was, you know, part of the people involved, Frank Olver in particular, it had to be a book. From his perspective, you know, the new version of Abramovitz and Stegan should be a book. But at the same time, it should also be a web resource. So clearly, to put this in any form and get the material from the various mathematicians and engineers and so forth who would be writing the chapters, tech was the only choice. And eventually pushed for LaTeX, and specifically with AMS, you know, packages and extensions. Had to convert a few people from plain tech to writing in LaTeX, and for some it was painful, but some thanked me. At any rate, so as this is going along and the options for how do we get this on the web, exploring the options and thinking, well, you know, there's this program, there's LaTeX for HTML, there's TeX for HT, there's this, there's that. There should be ways to do it. And the deeper we got, the more we realized that there wasn't quite the way we needed. So started developing LaTeXML on our own. Anyway, so DLMF, as it ended up being called, the Digital Library of Mathematical Functions, has been on the web now for what, a dozen years, roughly. DLMF.nis.gov. Hopefully, any of you who are fond of special functions already know about it. And this is generated from LaTeX sources, as is the, I don't have a copy of it here at my home office. Yep, there it is. Nelson's got one. That's the new version from Cambridge Press. And that's the old version. And let's see, where was I? Okay, so we managed to get this thing on the web, and then, well, now we've got this hammer. What do we do? Let's play with it. After various enhancements and, you know, continuing to try to improve DLMF, add features, add bells and whistles. Oh, I should step back and say the objective was to get it into HTML, to get the math into MathML, gradually in lurches, we get graphics either into SVG, sometimes WebGL, It's a continuous process to try to keep up with the life of the web. Somewhere along the lines, someone, probably Michael Kohlhase or Heinrich Stammer-Johanns were playing with the idea, well, gee, there's an awful lot of text sources on the arXiv. Wouldn't it be fun to see what you can do with that? Well, so we did. And that became a kind of a spin-off project, both as a development test bed and as a data test bed. There's a massive amount of scientific documents in not just math, physics, engineering, you name it, that could be a very fascinating data resource if you can put it into machine readable form. So that became an interesting side project. I'll leave Deyan to say more about that because that's where his mastery comes in. Yeah, well, that should be enough as an introduction. That's what gives a hint as to what LaTeXML is.
You've certainly described the route, both in terms of the origin and the path you followed, and you nicely described the purpose, which is to bring a monumental and classical work in numerical mathematics, if that's the right word, well, special functions, or somebody called them useful functions, into the late 20th, early 21st century. And as you're saying, dual publishing in HTML and PDF is really, really important. As I remember, HTML started around about the same time as TeX started taking off in publishing. So,
and ostensibly for the purpose of scientific publication, although in practice it's more for selling widgets and showing cat videos.
Well, print was the same, wasn't it? It was supposed to be for printing the Bible, and it turned out to be scurrilous pamphlets. Would you like to have a go, Deyan?
Sure. Thanks to Bruce for setting it up for my life to start, pretty much. I'm just about half Bruce's age, I guess, at this point. And I have a much shorter story, respectively. I'm a trained computer scientist with Michael Kohlhase, in fact. And my interest entering university was artificial intelligence, and it remains to this day academically artificial intelligence, especially connected to natural language processing on scientific documents. And a first question you have to ask yourself when you have such an interest is, are the documents machine readable, which is exactly where Bruce ended. And that is where my story starts back in 2006, when I was actually first introduced to TeX myself and to LaTeX. I was also first introduced to the question of using LaTeX as a data source for modeling artificial intelligence experiments. In that process, I gradually learned more about typesetting. I'm now a lot more comfortable with the topic than I was back then, and have been working with Bruce to kind of join the perspectives of what is useful to a publisher, what is useful to a mathematician, to a reader, and then what is useful to practitioners that may want to use the data for experiments. Interestingly enough, the same requirements you have to do research on data are in place to do accessibility on data and to do any added-on service that may be helpful to accessible and non-accessible users alike. If you want to have an index, if you want to have a glossary with all kinds of interactivity and alternative other secondary services on a document, machine readability is primary. So the same requirements really are at play, whether you're talking about accessibility or other services. So LaTeXML was the choice made for me in a way that I grew to like. In fact, it was a reasonable choice, and we've made it even better. I've been busy in the last 15 years to a big extent, beyond helping Bruce with the LMF a little bit, was exactly focusing on the arXiv corpus and currently pushing it to 80% coverage. We're at 75% successful conversions of arXiv. Just about we have 1.8 million viewable documents, but that is the 97% mark. It's about 1.5 million documents that are successfully converting with LaTeXML. And yeah, so probably this is a good place to pause my introduction and say that from my perspective and perspective of people in my generation, the default now is, oh, this should be a web resource, and maybe we should also consider a printed book, which is the mirror of what Bruce stated about the LMF when it was starting, that this should definitely be a book and maybe we should have a web resource. I think that expectation is now slightly reversed nowadays.
Of course, in the development of the new handbook and the DLMF, there were certain, shall we call them, cultural conflicts in print versus web versus this versus that, but fairly successfully navigated that.
Could I ask a question of Bruce and Deyan? Now that you've got this enormous corpus with millions and millions of equations in these arXiv.org documents, plus the NIST handbook, is any work going on to try to put the mathematics into algebra systems for proving, as well as for automated graphing and so on?
Yes, well, that's where Deyan's language perspective comes in. How to it's hard to know what to say there. It's very definitely active in our intentions. It's active in our work to varying degrees. We kind of oscillate between having some, technical fun, getting a nice web page that looks pretty. Every so often we like to focus on the quote easy stuff. Other times we're really pondering that. It's a very hard question. Especially, well, there's kind of a split. So in DLMF, I can say a lot. Since we have control over the sources, we've developed a set of what we can call semantic macros, so that basically all the several hundred special functions and mathematical concepts that are used frequently have their own macros, which both simplify things for the authors in that you'll get a consistent presentation of the formula in either print or in the MathML, but you also know the semantics of what that J, this particular J is Bessel function, that J is a different one, and so on and so forth. And the argument structure. Now then we, to get from there to something computable, there's still a fair amount of ambiguity that that sneaks in. You know, in most cases, you can decide that, well, a superscript in this position on that function, that's a power. Other places, it's not so obvious. To write all this stuff out completely unambiguous is more than any author wants to write. And to completely disambiguate everything, you know, based on some smarts is not something that we have completed, but we've worked towards with, we've been trying to explore what's the minimum amount that an author can provide such that we can unambiguously interpret the mathematics of what they've given us. And that's an ongoing project. In arXiv, it's such open, wild territory. How much can you infer? Well, open question. Probably Deyan has more interesting things to say than I can. There's yeah, maybe I should leave it at that. Let Deyan jump in and save me from myself.
Off you go, Diane.
I see. Oh, thank you. Yeah, what is the best perspective? It's definitely a research problem. In fact, again, mirror research problem for accessibility, because I know the Tech Hour is very interested in this. If you have not provided any information beyond standard LaTeX for an image or a formula, and you're writing higher mathematics, an accessibility tool that is trying to read out the mathematics to a reader has nothing to go on beyond the characters written on the page. And in the worst example, these are the fences, the parentheses. So in quite a lot of situations, you will be hearing open parenthesis, open square bracket, open brace, close square bracket, close parenthesis, over and over and over again, which is extremely tedious in speech, a little bit better in Braille. And the issue is, of course, you do not have enough information to compute the resolution at which you should be pronouncing an expression. And that is the exact problem you have for computation. You don't have enough information to decide what is the symbolic form you want to be computing on. Because it's not always the case that it's a unique form. Sometimes a group is a group, but sometimes you're thinking of the carrier set. And now you have to be thinking of a set. And so the symbolic form shifts for the computation on the particular line in your paper. And these questions are difficult, and the best way to practically remediate is with the author providing information with the macros Bruce was explaining. But however, I would say that I'm very optimistic that in the next 5 years, we will have some really interesting AI models that will be helping for the easy cases. And there's a good 80-20 situation where most of the cases are easy, because most of the formulas in arXiv are short. Actually, that's kind of immediate from the statistical distribution of things. It's a lot easier to write a short formula than a long one. And for the short formulas that are several characters long, I think we'll have very good results in figuring out both how to speak them and how to compute them in the next 5 years, just with emerging AI methods in deep learning. And I'll pause here.
I've got a few things I'm going to put in relating to the formal side of things. They're much more as an observer than as a participant, but there's an edge of being a participant here. So computer algebra is a question of checking the calculations. And there's a lot of advance on that, and the LLL algorithm is, I think, a fantastic piece of computer algebra. It allows you to find integer points in a lattice, which has been used to guess formulas that have been proved, for example. There's two other sides to this, I think. The one is integer sequences, which I found in my own amateur research, tremendously useful at times, because if you have a 10-digit integer and it appears in two places, you think there must be a connection. And Neil Sloan has created this wonderful online encyclopedia of integer sequences, which by some magic of the time machine predates the internet. And that's because it was published as, and this goes back to Abramovich and Stegan, it was originally published as a handbook of integer sequences, or an encyclopedia of integer sequences as a book. And then it went online, so it became the online encyclopedia. But that's tremendous. And I once found a physics paper from about 1905 relating to a piece of physics that I didn't really know about, wasn't interested in, but it produced exactly the same numbers as I was generating from an entirely different problem. So there are very significant connections arising from numerical coincidence, one of the most important of which is what's called monstrous moonshine, which relates the monster group and something called vertex algebras to modular forms, which are things used in the proof of Fermat's last theorem, and Richard Borcherd's got a Fields Medal for that. There's a third thing, which is proof assistance, which I've now reached, well, they're out of the laboratory and they're into the professional work toolbox, if you like, and they've reached some maturity. And one of the big signs of that, I think, was that a very deep mathematician, Peter Schulze, had some results about Banach spaces that he thought ought to be true. And he wrote a proof, a mathematician's proof of this. But being a good mathematician, he knows that proofs are not correct, and you don't know a proof is correct until it's checked. And a group of people coded that proof up so that we could build reliably on it using a new proof assistant called Lean, which I've played with, is quite attractive. And it seems to me plausible that in 20 or 30 years' time, a lot of mathematics proofs will be available in that form. And it's already a bit of an experimental part of the education of undergraduate mathematicians at Imperial College London, which is a hotshot institute. And Kevin Buzzard is the person associated with that. And so the idea that we will use TeX and LaTeX to write up our proofs will have to be taken with a pinch of salt or a certain amount of foresight, because it may be that just as we no longer do our calculations with pencil and paper, but we use computers to do our calculations. So we use computers to check our proofs. And the Lean proof assistant has a system called hints, which aren't exactly, I don't think, artificial intelligence, but they say to Lean, well, I think I've done enough here. Can you complete all the boring bits for me? Have I got that about right, Diane? Do you know about this stuff?
Oh yeah, I'm quite familiar with Kevin's work and the Lean community's work on a high level, and I'm very, very fond of it. I had a remark when they first bragged about some of these tactics that they're so intuitively correct to implement in such systems, because when a mathematician says in a paper, obviously or trivially, what they mean is there is a simple tactic that can be applied that anybody with an undergraduate level of mathematics can immediately think of. And these words in natural language really correspond to these nice little mini algorithms that will find the right steps and just bridge a 6-step mini proof into the hole that is there. Definitely, I think they're on the right track with using these things. One comment I would have is that I still think there will be informal mathematics that will not have a theorem prover backing in the open web. So I don't know about actual papers or textbooks, but definitely in communication. So emails, Stack Exchange questions, small bits of interchange, where people will not have the time to formalize or anchor all their symbols, but they would still like to communicate with each other. So some form of ASCII math or LaTeX math syntax will have to exist for those little snippets. But indeed, for a solid body of work that you want to make sure is formally true, I think an integration with a prover behind the paper, or even a situation where the paper is an exported version of a formal proof is very interesting, and it may be the direction we're going towards.
I think there's an argument to be made that the writing up of formal proofs will be something like literate programming. Well, on the one hand, we communicate to the human being the idea of the proof, and that might actually be the stuff that somebody like Peter Schulze might actually write. And then associated with each paragraph there's stuff that the computer understands. And so one needs both sets of tools to get the best results, which is exactly what Don Knuth is saying with literate programming. You need the typesetting tools to communicate with humans, and you need the programming language to communicate with the computer. I wonder if we could switch over to accessibility, particularly as Patrick Smythe is here, and he has a sort of personal experience about this that many of us don't. But before I do that, can I, Lee, do you have audio?
Yeah, right now.
Would you like to introduce yourself now that you can speak to us?
I don't have anything really to say. I'm here more out of curiosity than anything else, because I've seen the announcements for quite a while that I guess you've been putting out on the tech user groups. And I just happened to read one now and decided, well, I'll click in and see what's happening. I've been a user of TeX and LaTeX for a long time, and am pretty adept with it. But I don't do the types of things that you are regularly discussing here, because I'm more of a get the paper in, get it in shape to go into the journal and ship it out to the web and the for publication. So
we don't have enough people like you coming to these meetings.
Well,
so if you like it, please come again, and you can set the agenda if you want to.
Yeah, what I do is I have lots of scripts written in Perl to take a paper that is submitted and then change the bits around that are needed to satisfy publication requirements for the journal is the Real Analysis Exchange. And I've been trying for years to make it as automated as possible. And I have written a style file for the exchange. And we, of course, encourage the authors to use our style file. And if they do properly use our style file, then I have Perl scripts that will pretty much automate the butchering the paper into the form that we need. And that's the kind of stuff that I do, other than writing my own mathematical stuff.
You mentioned that you're the technical editor of a journal.
Yes, and
that's what you were talking about.
Yeah, the journal is the Real Analysis Exchange, which is a small journal devoted to real analysis that is has been published for the last 20 plus years and comes out twice a year. And so we end up doing maybe 60 papers a year that are accepted. And once the papers are accepted, then they send the LaTeX source to me, and that's where I get to have my way with it. And I've been trying to make it as automated as possible for quite a while. and now I've got it so that if they correctly use the style file I have written, I can pretty much just feed it to Perl and stand back.
I'm familiar, as you might have guessed from my previous remarks, with the Journal of Integer Sequences, and it has a fairly slick procedure. And I know that there are a lot of other, let's say, small mathematical journals that play a vital role. And it might be worthwhile having a tech hour focused on sharing information about that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, what's happening now, I think, and I've talked to a couple of other people about this, is that I have written the scripts, so I actually get several outputs from them. One is the version that's going to appear on paper, but we're also posting PDF versions to places like Project Euclid, and they have somewhat different requirements. And so I have the script generating several different versions of the paper so that I can send one off to Euclid and another one to the chief editor, who is then going to line them up in whatever order they're going to appear in for final publication. And I'd like to know what other people are doing, because there's a lot of tiny little things that have to be done, and it's very meticulous. And every time a new issue comes out, I end up making changes because I realize that I hadn't grepped something with, people have a tremendous imagination for the ways that they put things together.
Yeah.
And I have become quite adept at grep to try to put things into a form that are, or actually not only put things into a form, but find those things within the manuscript, because using something like LaTeX, especially if the person hasn't been using it for a while, there are going to be many different things that they don't know what some of us who are more experienced think of as the proper way to do stuff. And trying to find the invented methods is always a challenge, to try to put them into a form where they seem to be more in the spirit of the way that the LaTeX gurus want them to be done. So
the arXiv is quite an eye-opener in that regard.
Can we come to that later? Let me first of all say that I've written down in my notes, small journal publication tools might be a good topic for a future tech hour. The next thing is that when it becomes 1/2 the hour, you're welcome to leave if you want to, but you're also very welcome to stay. And I think this conversation is going so nicely and it's doing so well that I hope that many of us will want to stay. And I'd like to give as much of the rest of the time available till 7:30 to Patrick and his interests.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm really interested in, that was an interesting thing with, I'm also a fan of grep. I also find myself grepping things and trying to parse things out a bit. And I often find myself doing things like looking for double spaces and some of those common typographic errors that people make. And you'd kind of think there'd be a little more tooling around that. And maybe there is that I don't know about, but well, I guess, in this area, I guess my interests are making the generated outputs from certain tools. And the ones I use tend to be either Jupyter notebooks or org mode documents. I also have a big fan of org mode and Emacs. and kind of making some of those more accessible, people with disabilities. And so my business just recently, we just, I won't say who they are yet because it needs to be approved internally, and then I'll talk about it more. But like I'm working with organization in the sciences to make their outputs from Jupyter notebooks more accessible, specifically the HTML output. But I hope that it will lead to more development and on both the PDF part side of things and also like the actual editor, which in Jupyter Notebook is also kind of an accessibility nightmare. And I don't know if people have used Jupyter Notebooks before, but it's a really interesting, I don't know what you call it, like documents. It's very much like very Nuffian, right? Donald Knuth, in terms of it's like very much a tool for literate programming. So it's like a lab notebook. I think it's based roughly on, I'm trying to remember the name of the tool that people use in the sciences. What's it called?
Mathematica is
MATLAB, I think is what I'm thinking. Oh, Mathematica. You're right. It is based on Mathematica. Yeah, yeah. So, but you know, and so it's this lab notebook thing, and you write text, you write code, and then the code generates various outputs, including like charts and so on, which are their own accessibility issues. And then that gets, you can then export that to different formats, where it's HTML. And the HTML is broadly kind of more or less accessible. It's just not, you know, it's not great, but it's accessible, just not like up to standards or whatever. So we're hopefully we get this approval. We're gonna improve the accessibility of that output, and then it would be great then to write more grants and stuff. And because honestly, it's really terrible that Jupyter notebooks, they're so widely used in data science, and they're not. The editor is not at all accessible, and the outputs are sort of varyingly inaccessible or accessible. And actually, I know it's pretty well documented. There are like people who are like, yeah, I had to leave data science because these tools were inaccessible, like whether they were used to teach in their university or on the job and so on. And people are basically like, yeah, I guess I can't be a data scientist because these tools are not accessible. So that's something I care about and I'm working on a lot. And I also wrote my dissertation in org mode, which output to LaTeX, and which is its own adventure. And if people haven't played around with either Pandoc, which is kind of a similar workflow where you write, basically the idea is you write in a simplified format. So either Markdown, which is essentially was originally written as a human readable subset of HTML that you could write, and then a parser would go through it and generate HTML based on this thing. And it's intended to look like how people used to write emails kind of in the early days of the web, you know, where you put like a hashtag for a heading, and you put, you know, you might put a bunch of underscores underneath something to make it also look like a heading, that kind of a thing. And it takes that and it turns it into HTML. But now people like to use it for everything. And org mode is also kind of like a, you know, similar to Markdown. It's kind of a human readable markup format. And it's kind of a cool workflow. You write things in those markup formats, and then you send it to a processor, and it produces, you know, a nice PDF. Ideally, it produces a nice PDF, but it creates a lot of wrinkles, right? When you're like, you know, you create a abstraction layer between you and the thing. So often, you know, the abstraction becomes leaky and a problem. And but it's when you get it working, it's very satisfying. And I did write my dissertation in the org mode and then output it to LaTeX. And that's probably where I know most of my LaTeX from, is doing that kind of process. I've used it a few times before, but that's me.
I'm one to float an idea. The tech has been running for about an hour now. Sorry, for about a year now. And something like February last year, we had about 20 people turn up to an accessibility meeting, and I couldn't do anything with it because there were all these people and all these things they wanted to say, and they had all these hopes, and I couldn't possibly realize everything there. But it told me that accessibility is a big, important issue, and people want to be in contact with each other about it. And what seems to me best for the Tech Hour sort of got a cycle, and it sort of has various threads in it. And I'd like one of those threads to be, if you like, a cutting off the Tech Hour that becomes important in its own right and forgets its origin if necessary. And I'm thinking that an accessible STEM hour once a month, it doesn't have to be at Thursday, doesn't have to conflict with the W3C Math Working Group, and it doesn't have to be hosted by me. I've got a Zoom license, but I'm happy to let somebody else use it. So I'm particularly interested in Diane, Patrick, and Bruce because they got a real stake in accessibility. What does that sound like for you?
I mean, it sounds good to me. I mean, I could definitely put in some time putting a few of the things.
One at a time,
please.
please.
Have core organizers. So.
Sorry, you need core organizers.
It would be nice to have a co-organizer or so, but
yeah.
I could, you know, I could also kind of start things off and see how it goes. But I mean, you know, I just know a lot of the stuff is all, as you well know, Jonathan, organizing, and I've, you know, kind of run events over the last few years. I organized a Python user group and so on in my last job. And certainly, you know, there's certainly a certain amount of work that goes in. So it helps to have people who are who also do it.
I'm happy to keep putting work in as long as there's a matching contribution from other people. Let's put it that way. Bruce, Diane?
Yeah, it sounds like it's definitely worth a try to extend. What I'm wondering is whether you can attract something that's traditionally very difficult, and I regret, because I've been trying to rile people up behind the scenes, but it's very difficult to just have developers of different tools meet in that accessibility tech hour, because what happens is it's understandable that developers like to stay close to the tools they develop, I think. That makes a lot of sense because we put a lot of investment in just understanding what we've done. If we have 5 or 10 people, each with their own tool, all working to solve one accessibility problem specifically, that would be very fruitful, I think, if we're in the same meeting once a month. Not to collaborate between the tools directly, but to collaborate on let's all together solve one important social problem for accessibility. That would be very nice. And that actually connects with the question I had to the participants of the Tech Hour themselves, or the main participants, let's say, which is the one thing where we can intersect very fruitfully is to find this LaTeX dialect that is accessible for the standard types of content that people write. Because even things as simple as adding an out attribute to an image where you provide the alt text, the accessible text behind the image, are not standard in LaTeX. And having that list, first of all, written down explicitly and then macro standardized for it would really help LaTeX become accessible on the input side.
Bruce, your turn, if you want to.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there. I think there's a lot of information out there that doesn't get to the people that could use it, and there's, as was alluded to, there's also camps that sometimes intentionally don't communicate. I think that there's some good potential there. I don't know enough of, you know, I'm more in the position to be fishing for information, not really in a position to be leading anything. But you know, there's way too much I need to learn, and I'm having a hard time learning it. What is it that needs to be said if you're going to pronounce this formula? What's the form it needs to be in that is most useful to different kinds of different kinds of people? You know, that's hard to find out. You know, and I'm partly in a position within a limited context. You know, if we're talking about, you know, I'm kind of tech oriented or LaTeX oriented. I can work within that realm. How do I get from there to the accessibility? But LaTeX and TeX isn't the only you know, source or format that needs this. And the more we're coming from different perspectives to find common solutions, the better everyone will be, I think. You know, whether it's tech, whether it's JavaScript, whether it's web, whether it's PDF, somewhere there's something common that we ought to be aiming for.
I think it's easy to underestimate the special skills you have. So I used to work at the Open University. I worked there for about 17 years, 15, 17 years. So I know people there and they know things even if I don't. And the Open University has a lot of disabled students of all sorts because it's a good place for, you know, the one place where a disabled student should really feel at home is at home. And that makes distance learning a more attractive proposition. And the Open University's got an accessibility aspect to it. So in that respect, I've got special knowledge, and I've got special knowledge of the integer sequences, of research mathematics. Bruce, you've got special knowledge about how to get stuff from the archive and do things with it. And on the blind programmers list, people who said, well, I work as a programmer, but sometimes I'm stymied about what I can do because I can't read research articles that I need to know. And those small pieces of knowledge that you don't consider important because you've known them for so long might be just what they need. And the small pieces of knowledge that they've got might fill a gap for you. So this sort of interchange is quite important. And I'm reminded that in classical Greece, in ancient Greece, they had an institution called the Agora, and it had two functions. The one was it was the marketplace, and the other was it was people met for democracy in Athens. There's the old Agora in Athens, and it's a big square. And sort of big squares in modern cities also provide a similar role of marketplace and meeting place. So I'm hoping that a sort of tech hour, well, except it won't be a tech hour, a STEM accessibility hour, might benefit all that participate. And I have sort of funny special gifts, like I've built up a relationship with Jonathan Godfrey, who's a regular on the blind math mailing list, and he's a blind senior lecturer of statistics in New Zealand. And he uses R for all this stuff, and all this stuff he produces is accessible because it has to be, because he has to read it. So I've got contacts, we've all got contacts that can help.
I think the math people in the math working group would be interested in this as well. This is, you know, one of the topics of interest. I mean, MathML is more accessible than its predecessor, raster images, but could be even more accessible. There's ambiguities in the notation, the presentation notations. And, you know, there again comes the question of what's the minimal amount that one could add to annotate MathML that would get you across the hurdle to where you can actually make this information accessible. And you know, the group is working on that topic, and you know, personally I think we would welcome you know, knowledgeable contribution to that topic.
Well, I post advertisements for the tech hour, not only to the tech list that you probably see, but also to the blind math mailing list and the visually impaired programmers list. And what's happening at the moment, I think, is that both blind math and visually impaired programmers are getting a strong interest in what Patrick is also dealing with, which is data science.
Mm-hmm.
You need mathematics for data science, and you need programming. And I think there's a real opportunity to sort of get more of a bridge between blind math and visually impaired programmers that way. The two communities seem to be rather different, because blind math is more focused on education, and the visually impaired programmers is more focused on employment and work. So the different stages in career. Are you agreeing with that, Patrick? Do you want to add to that?
I think there's overlap, but yeah, broadly speaking, I think you're correct.
I have
Okay,
a
so-
question. Can I ask a question that
Sure.
that's maybe
Come
a
in.
little out of the mainstream? Well, it is in the mainstream of what you're just talking about, but what is the status of MathJax regarding accessibility?
My tuppence worth is everybody uses it, and it's the best there is. And if you've got something better and you want to publish it, get people using it. The way to do it is to get it incorporated into MathJax. But-
Is MathJax written in such a way that it is accessible to blind people?
I'm not a blind person.
I mean, I think I've seen it recommended. I'm not a mathematician, so, and you know, and the few times I have to look at an equation, I like blow it up to 1,000,000 times and look at it or whatever. But I, you know, and my understanding is it's part of the, you know, maybe Jonathan, you would probably know.
I think Jonathan Godfrey would be the blind expert
Yeah,
on this.
absolutely.
And his advice is don't use PDF, use HTML. HTML is accessible, and that includes the mathematics. And I assume that MathJax is part of that suite. The other thing is Volker Sorge. There's another thing also, which is Pretext, which is both a production system and a project to produce open source textbooks. And the people there can produce a variety of outputs, including HTML, EPUB, PDF, and Braille. Braille, for those people that have Braille, Braille is very important because it allows precise reading, checking of what's going on. So, you know, when you're debugging and you can't tell, you put a comma instead of a period, and it doesn't work, and you have to find that thing. Well, if you're blind, Braille and can use Braille, Braille is one of the great things for that.
Yeah, I started to learn it just for that purpose, but it, you know, I got distracted.
Okay.
Also, they're very expensive. They're refreshable Braille displays. You have to find someone who's going to pay for that. They're like, they can be like, it's like buying a car or something.
Yeah, and they can wear out, can't they? And need replacement.
I mean, I've heard of them lasting a long time. It depends, I suppose. I mean, it would be very disappointed if they did wear out, because they could cost like 7, 8, 9,000. And you really, you know, if you're a programmer, you really want that 80 cell one. You know, which is like, those are more like the $14,000 ones, I think.
I think they get dirt inside them, was something I read. I've seen them being used by the disability officer at the Open University, Jeff Bashton, who's blind. And one thing that really impressed me was the way in which he was able to be the central person of the meeting and be aware of what's going on without seeing anybody. I thought that
Yeah,
was
I'm jealous because the people who are good with them can take notes really well. And also they can do things like you can watch a subtitled TV show and listen to the audio, and you can also get all the, if you're fast, you can do that. Whereas if I want to listen to a subtitle thing, I have to have the robot voice speaking over the subtitles.
One thing that impressed me about the US National Federation for the Blind, is it Federation for the Blind or of the Blind? I think it might be of the blind. It's the way in which it's not an organization for blind people, but of blind people, and that they essentially run it. And if an accessible STEM meeting once a month could have at least some of that character, and some part of it at least, which was firmly in the control of visually impaired and other disabled people, I would think that's would be a great plus, and it would be hard to achieve, and it may require, so to speak, visual people providing volunteer technical support.
I mean, it's funny, you know, it does feel like there's missing pieces to a lot of these community things, just because, to my knowledge, like, for example, that the programming list that you post on about the TeX hour, or the Tech hour, I always, I don't think they meet, you know, and I don't know of like an ongoing like visually impaired programming meetup. So it definitely feels like there are missing parts of the community that could be filled in a little bit. But
I think training would be one spot where, particularly in these sort of socially distanced times, one spot where meeting will become more important. And Jonathan Godfrey sent me an email saying, well, one of the things we're actually missing is really good, accessible, basic tutorials in programming.
Yeah, that was what I was trying to write that federal grant about, that I didn't get it. I didn't get approved to submit in time, but that was what I wanted to.
Well, we could still use your proposal because I'm sure it's got good ideas.
I mean, I hope to put it in another time, you know, or
Yeah.
maybe next year or something like that. But, or if people hear about places to propose, I might have to hop off, Jonathan, but I feel like we're circling around something very good here. So, and I'm willing. I take on too many things, so I'm, you know, 20% hesitant, 80% excited. You know, so.
Well, you got to be both an optimist and a pessimist, haven't you?
Well, you know, I am a pessimist. I agree. I try to be somewhere in between. I try to balance a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
Do you want to hop off now and say goodbye to everyone?
Cheers all.
All right. I'm going to have to take off as well.
Well, it's been really nice having you, Bruce.
Thank you.
And we'll have to make sure that we can avoid your working group meetings so that you can come more often.
You know, I see the announcements come through the mail. I'll have to keep a watch on when there's a gap either in time zones or other scheduling, and join whenever I can. I have to say, I met two or three of you a couple of decades ago back at Tech Users Group meetings. You may not remember me, but
I remember meeting you in Birmingham at the.
Yep.
And there was a restaurant afterwards, a meal afterwards in an Indian restaurant, which was very nice afterwards. I remember.
Yes, I think that was the first Vindaloo I had.
Yeah, that was the mathematical knowledge management.
Yep.
Whose sort of purpose I didn't really understand at that time, but I do now, because finding things is really important.
Yeah. Yep.
I had a question for Jonathan. Do you plan to keep the meetings at 6:30 UTC GMT, or do you change to when Britain goes on summertime?
They've always been 6:30 local time.
Okay.
I mean, except once I hold it at a strange time so that Jonathan Godfrey could attend. It's quite difficult to get. He had to get up early and I had to stay up late so that we could talk together live.
Yeah, but when does Britain move to summertime?
This Sunday.
This Sunday. Okay, so for me next week it'll be back an hour earlier than today.
That's right. So we've got a special disjunction here where the working group and the tech hour are no longer at the same cosmic time. Do you have any comments, Diane? And do you want to stay longer, or do you want to say goodbye too?
I will probably depart together with Bruce, given that our next meeting is together again. So he will need me in 15 minutes.
Right.
I had two comments, just quickly. One is to advertise that the arXiv, LaTeXML converted arXiv, has 877 million formulas. I've counted them. My computer has counted them just last week. So there is a lot of content that exists written in good old school LaTeX that needs to be made accessible. And that is a need I have personally accepted that is there. So I will not rest until these at least some part of these 800 million formulas end up accessible to all people who need them. And that would be my wrap-up statement for the day. And
I've got something important I forgot to say, which is, sorry, it would be great if when you submit an article to the archive, you've got an accessibility report to nudge you to fix accessibility problems and to make it easier for future software to make the best of your results. And you're both.
I agree completely.
Bruce, and
yeah.
So that I think should be a top priority community project, and it should get the support from the LaTeX project because they want to produce tagged PDF that's accessible. And if they know that certain things don't work, then those should be checked for early.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, that sounds completely correct.
So we're all together on that. I dare say Nelson's with it too.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's nodding. Great. So shall I leave you so that you can prepare for your next meeting?
All right.
Yeah.
Nice seeing you. Really great
Nice
having
seeing
you
you guys again. Nice to see you, Jonathan, Nelson.
I hope it's more than once a year.
And William looks familiar to me as well, but I can't say for sure we've met.